Welcome back. We have arrived to the last panel discussion of the Economic Ideas Forum, the age of artificial intelligence and disruptive technologies, reimagining regulation and society. To keep the debate lively, I invite you to use the hashtag EIF20 on social media by leaving your comments and questions, and we'll pose you the last slide poll of the day with the code EIF20. Is the rise of artificial intelligence a positive or negative development? We look forward to our last panelists shedding the light on these important topics. And for that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the fourth and last discussion, Policy Director of the Martin Center, Roland Freundestein. Roland, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. And welcome to everyone to this last panel of EIF 20. We have now discussed sustainability and the Green Deal. We've discussed trade and the pitfalls of international economic exchange. We have discussed the digital sphere and the conundrums of liberty, privacy, and credibility and creativity. And now we're coming to the topic where arguably the hopes and fears of mankind arguably lie most closely together. And that is probably because it reaches most deeply into our collective subconscious. Artificial intelligence. So, machines who think. That was actually the title of a textbook I used in the 1980s studying in California. So robots, computers, self-driving cars, and autonomous weapon systems, to name but a few. And let's remember one thing, that AI, in one form or the other, has been the stuff of legends, of myths, of dreams, of nightmares, of utopias and dystopias alike, basically since antiquity. The new thing in the last couple of years, maybe 20 years, is that it has also quickly become the stuff of legislation, of economics and the labor market, and of great power competition. So, I'd like to introduce our speakers who have joined us for this. We start with Eva Meidel, a member of the European Parliament from the EPP group. We have Alexander Stubb, a former Prime Minister of Finland and currently director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute of Florence. We have Daniel Schönberger, the head of legal services in Switzerland and Austria of Google. We have Joanna Bryson, professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And last but not least, Žiga Turk, professor at the University of Ljubljana, former member of the Slovenian government, and a member of the Academic Council of the Martin Center. So thank you all for joining. Just some house rules now to start with. We agreed to initially stick to 3 to 4 minutes for the kickoff statements for every speaker. And then we can have follow-up questions from me and or a mutual conversation among the speakers. And of course, there will be space for Q&A from the audience. Not to forget the Slido question that Anna just already mentioned in the intro. And now, before we turn to the big philosophical questions, I'd like to explore some of the aspects closer to home. In other words, the EU and AI, our approach in Brussels, Strasbourg, and the national capitals. And for this, I'd like to turn to Eva Meidel first. So the question to you would be, is Europe ready for AI? Does the Commission white paper on artificial intelligence strike the right balance between regulation and development? Over to you, Eva.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be joining this panel. Well, I am often called to say that Europe doesn't do anything by itself or alone. I think Europe is as ready as its citizens are. So what we do as European institutions is either driven or is urged by its citizens. And I think that a year and a half ago, when we had the European elections, citizens very clearly basically stated that they would like to see a European Union that looks forward and not backwards, a European Union that makes sure that we help our societies, but our businesses and enterprises as well, in the long run of being more competitive, producing better opportunities, enabling our citizens and our businesses. And one way to do that is using technologies. So I will have 3 points that I would like to in order to answer your question. One is based on leadership, and the second one is based more on some actionable points by those leaders. And finally, what the European Parliament is doing in terms of solutions. So I think that what's really key for us to see is that over the past 10 years or so, the technology topic has been, in a way, on the agenda of key leaders. But I often am caught to say in settings such as this one that I still think that we actually need real digital leadership, more digital leaders in Europe. What would that mean? I mean, it would be very nice if we have prime ministers and ministers that code, and maybe we do have some. But what is more important is that these are leaders that embrace technology and are able to deliver with actionable projects and decision makings. So we would like to see digital leaders that could provide through their vision a secure, a protective way of dealing with privacy and data, but also an enabling way of delivering to our citizens those technologies. I think that a number of leaders today in Europe have understood that digital solutions, and in particular also AI, can enable us to go through certain challenges that we face, or to make us more competitive. So in this respect, when it comes to the more actionable points, we can see that the white paper that was put forward to the Commission, it in a way ticks all the right boxes. It's a good start. It speaks about data, it speaks about innovation, it focuses particularly on SMEs and skills, but also on the development of trustworthy AI ecosystem, and most importantly also addresses certain societal risk. So what is key there is that it's on a paper, right? We are expecting to see some more legislative action, but what is important is that this AI buzz turns back to being a buzz into the institutions, whether they're member states institutions or European institutions, and creates some action. So projects that are related into solving societal issues and problems. Projects that are using very well all the funding that we are currently discussing, be it the budget or the recovery fund, that will enable us to progress and not just stay where we were a year or two ago or where we are today. I think we've missed an opportunity 10 years ago to kind of advance our economies and push them even further by enabling key technologies. So we cannot currently sit and compare ourselves to other nations or to companies that have been prosperous and started themselves outside of Europe and just want to replicate that. I think we need to think in a different dimension. Where are we strong? And one area where we are very strong is producing industrial data, for example. So why not harness that potential and build on it and be able to deliver solutions that would help our businesses and our societies? So in this respect, what the European Parliament is currently doing is we are trying to understand and address the current challenges that businesses and society are facing in deploying AI. And so this is why we have set up a special committee on artificial intelligence in the digital age, for which I'm the speaker for the EPP group, where we would like to make sure that this committee is like the forum, the place on a European level, where we will be discussing the future trends to come and those future trends that would help our companies actually harness the potential of data and be able to deploy new type of solutions to increase their productivity, for example. We very much hope that it would be a committee not to focus on issues we've been discussing over the past 5 or 10 years, but it would be a committee that would work on the next cutting edge legislation that would not necessarily be focused on restricting, but it will be focusing on enabling our economies and societies to grow and to prosper.
Thank you. Thanks, Eva. I have a follow-up question. Surprise, maybe. If you talk about enabling, how much of this is on content and on solutions offered by institutions, be it the European institutions or national ones, and how much is sheer money, is a kind of concerted effort to catch up, for Europe to catch up in comparison to competitors in China and the US, for example? I mean, what's the mix here between concepts and between resources?
Well, so first of all, I think institutions have to lead by example. So we cannot just be preaching and saying what the business should be doing or society should be doing. I think we also need to show that we could use effectively technologies that could help and support our work. And that is not just setting up a Zoom or a WebEx or some other type of account. It is going beyond that. And we already have worked with a number of also researchers and businesses that could show how much we can enable the workings of institutions if we actually enforce certain AI solutions into our daily works. So that's on one hand. On the other hand is we currently have a package that's being discussed with an amount that is never been on the table before in Europe. So we need to make sure that we use it in a very forward-looking and sensible way. And as I said, on one hand, it's important to compare ourselves where we are. We need to know where Europe is currently standing in the global competition and that we are lagging behind on certain developments. And we need to see whether those investments are done, whether future investments could be done in the right way in order for Europe to also lead the way. So I would like to see a more so to say, unified vision in a way where possible, because if each country invests in a completely different sphere and area, it would be way more difficult for us to advance in our technological development in the next couple of years. So a little bit more vision on a European level would help. We had a European Council meeting that provided some, I would say, more concrete conclusions than we've witnessed before when it comes to enabling technologies. But ideally, we have a council meeting just focused on the technological advancement in Europe. I think that we have pressing issues such as the health crisis or migration. We should put the advancement of technologies almost at the same level, because my question to you, Roland, would be, why did you decide to have the technological panel at the end at this Economic Ideas Forum? Because I, in a way, believe that in order for us to have the progress we want to see and achieve this very ambitious aim related to the Green Deal, for example, we need to have the innovation and technologies to do so. So without this, I think it will be way more difficult for us to manage risk or to foresee certain challenges coming our way. And technologies could definitely make us way more prepared and agile for future challenges and issues.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you also for the question. Of course, one might always ask whether the most important stuff should come first or should come last as a result of the other debates. So that I'll leave that to future fora in the Martin Center. But anyway, Let me now turn to Alexander Stubb and ask him, if as Eva said, it's all about a unified approach, about leadership and leading by example, but also about, well, enabling through providing solutions, then in your view, is the recovery fund that we're now discussing, is the upcoming budget, the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union, reflecting these priorities? Is there enough money? Are there enough resources for artificial intelligence and the other top technologies that we're talking about here? Over to you.
Thanks for the question, Roland, and thanks for having me as well. I guess the short answer to your question is no. There's never going to be enough money put down on issues linked to the digital revolution. But in many ways, I think things are relative. So the first answer is to say that the recovery fund and the MFF would only be a partial solution in trying to generate the digital revolution in one way or another. Of course, I think the focus should be very much on innovation and research and development. And what unfortunately, as so many times before we saw with the MFF negotiations and the recovery fund, was that when the horse trading took place last minute, we saw quite a radical drop actually in R&D money and money linked to innovation and a move more towards direct grants. So I guess the answer is no, but it is a good beginning. Now, I'm very much with Eva on this, as so often before. I think one of the we have in Europe at the moment in the debate is that we're fighting old battles. So, we get involved in this debate about, on Fortune 500, the top 40 IT companies are either Chinese or American. There are no European companies which are forging the way ahead or are pioneering in this. Look, we don't have Google, we don't have Amazon, we didn't do Facebook, we didn't do Twitter, we didn't do Instagram, we didn't do Snapchat, we didn't even do TikTok, we didn't do WeChat, we don't have Alibaba. We're doomed. And I think this is a very old-fashioned way of doing it. But the digital revolution is by definition extremely agile and extremely quick. So that means that you really have to think ahead. Now, what should we do? I think what we did in the 1990s was to look ahead. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Bangemann report. Eva probably is not. But that was about telecoms. And then what we ended up doing, of course, was having a common 3G standard at the time, which forged us ahead of the Americans in the so-called digital revolution at that time. Of course, it was a time when Nokia was born, Ericsson was born, and many others as well. And then we sort of got a little bit lazy, I think, and thought that, hey, we've got this, we've got this. And then, of course, the Americans who had 50 different internal markets on telecoms were left behind. Well, I think we really shouldn't be sort of, how would I say, crying over the fact that the US came up with Google and the rest of it. We need to look at things ahead. And I'll finish off with 2 points. For me, first of all, this is about a balance. It's about a balance between three things: regulation, competition, and finance. And remember that the European Union is a regulatory superpower. Remember that the European Commission has exclusive competence on competition, in other words, on antitrust. And remember that right now there seems to be resources which we could use to finance. So that's what the public sector can kind of do. But my second point is probably more a point of principle. And I think that the European Union leaders need to focus on three things. First, start, and this is, I'm glad there is a committee in the European Parliament that is looking to the future rather than the past. But, try to suss out the new areas. And Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, there were some, I think, new areas that were outlined. So look, for instance, at biotech. So when you start combining biology and technology, when us, the human beings, become some form of cyborgs, not only because we're on our phones all the time, but also when we start getting neural laces, what can we find in that extremely interesting field, which has a lot to do about the future of Homo sapiens? Look at data. If it's the new gold, if it's the new oil, how are we going to deal with that? I know a lot of people laughed at the GDPR, but they didn't laugh anymore after Cambridge Analytica. What can we do on 5G? How about the semiconductor industry, where I think actually the Chinese are lagging behind and are desperately trying to get their own mechanism working? So there are just a few areas. Secondly, regulate smartly. I do think that one of the key issues that we're going to see in the future is what you mentioned, Roland, artificial intelligence, and especially the ethical slash moral aspect of it. And I'm very glad that the European Commission has already for years been working on human-centric AI. And the question is, who is going to set the rules on things linked to artificial intelligence and things linked to the combination of biology and technology? For me, this is a little bit like the Human Rights Convention 75 years ago. We need to start looking at rules and regulation on how it's going to work. And I somehow don't see any better place to do it than Europe, the European Union, perhaps inside the UN together with countries with similar values, because I'd much rather the good guys do the algorithms than the bad guys. The third and final focus that I think we should have is to understand that the technological revolution is also deeply embedded into foreign policy and geopolitics. And the way in which I see it, we have three power blocks emerging. One is China with its own system, its own philosophy. Let's even stop pretending that China is ever going to turn into a traditional Western style liberal democracy. The way in which it's going to drive the technological revolution, if the axis is between digital dictatorship and digital democracy, it's going to be more on the control side. The second block is obviously the United States, and I think they are and should continue to be a close ally of ours. And the third one is how we deal with this ourselves. So I'm glad that there's a lot of awareness, and I'm glad that it's one of the top three projects of the European Commission. I don't think we are too late. I think just we need to look ahead. That's going to be the key in all of this, Roland.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexander. Just one brief follow-up here. You mentioned China, and it's going to be rather on the control side. You mentioned Europe as kind of being almost the antipode, maybe together with the US, to that approach. How do we get the Chinese to actually jump on our bandwagon, and how do we get them to rather adopt our rules of the game?
I think they will have to adopt our rules of the game outside Chinese borders, but we should stop pretending that this will happen inside. If you look at different applications that are linked to social ranking, for instance, in China at the moment. So, for instance, you use an app, and based on your behavior, your health records, your food shopping, your travel, your exercise, you start looking at different ways in which insurance is being dealt with, and whether you're a good citizen and bad citizen. That's not going to happen. And I think the Chinese are going to create, and have already created, very much their own system, whether it's on WeChat, whether it's based on Alibaba, or anything of that sort. But I think what we need to make sure is that once the Chinese go over their borders, for instance, when they're doing the Belt and Road Initiative, and others, that they play by our rules. The Confucius model is quite different from the fairly individualistic model that we have in Europe. So we should stop pretending that they're going to adapt our system. That's why I think our best bet is to work closely with the Americans, not against them.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alexander. And let me now turn to Daniel Schönberger. And just refer to the recent visit in Brussels of your CEO, Mr. Pichai, who called for specific governmental regulation on AI. Now, having in mind that big tech companies such as Google were initially fighting European legislation when it came to GDPR, how does that balance out? And is big tech happy with the efforts of the European Union on AI?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad that I can contribute to this very interesting panel. So is big tech happy? Well, let me put it that way. As you had mentioned some months ago, Google CEO Sundar Pichai visiting Brussels made it very clear that AI is simply too important to not regulate it. The challenge, of course, is to do this in a way that is proportionate and does not unduly hinder innovation. Obviously, we are seeing extremely disruptive times at the moment, and Google strongly believes in the positive contributions that AI can make in Europe and also to its businesses. This includes in particular the current COVID-19 situation, where AI can help in many ways, for example, in boosting knowledge sharing, contributing to research for a cure, and then more long-term also in driving economic recovery of all the businesses. At the same time, of course, some properties of AI technologies, they do present new challenges that deserve further scrutiny indeed, for example, in terms of unfair bias or their potential for abuse. That said, the question is probably not so much whether big tech, whatever that means, by the way, is happy, but rather about what is good for society at large. So on a general note, we welcome the Commission's dual approach for the ecosystem of excellence on the one side and the ecosystem of trust. Conceptually, we also agree with the Commission's direction on a focus and the focus on so-called high-risk AI. However, there are some areas where we think that greater clarification and a more proportionate and targeted approach would be mandated. In particular, we think it's important to get the scoping and the definitions right in the first place. We worry that some equate AI with algorithms or want regulation for all AI applications. We believe that the focus should be on the latest advances in machine learning and on applications with high risk profiles only. Also, it is vital that any risk assessment takes a holistic view, reflecting not only potential harms, but also societal benefits. Higher risk AI applications often present a huge improvement over the status quo. Thus, we think that the opportunity cost of not using AI should be factored in and given significant weight in that whole debate. Concerning the mandatory requirements considered for high-risk AI, we urgently ask the European legislator to refrain from making the rules too prescriptive. Regulation should still be flexible enough to accommodate future innovation. Ultimately, what matters is that the technologies are fair and safe, and that they respect fundamental rights, and this can be achieved in various ways. Equally, we would caution against too far-reaching information and records keeping obligations that could create privacy and security issues and also clash with trade secrets and intellectual property rights. As far as enforcement is concerned, we would support ex post enforcement as the most proportionate and practical mechanism. If the EU insists on ex ante enforcement, we strongly caution against third-party assessments or even upfront approvals, and would recommend instead self-assessment procedures based on very clear due diligence guidance. And finally, we worry about the potential direction the EU could take with regard to the liability rules for AI. So far, there's simply no evidence suggesting that the existing liability framework is broken, and overly rigid liability rules could easily disincentivize innovation in space. And on a closing note, I would just like to emphasize that Google introduced its own set of AI principles already 2.5 years ago. These principles put human and fundamental rights, safety, and also accountability center stage. And they also set out so-called red lines, and thus AI applications Google will not pursue. In any case, we are here as partner in this legislative process, and I would like to thank you again for the opportunity to share some of our thoughts with you today.
Thanks, Daniel. So summarizing here at this point, regulation, absolutely, but not when it impedes development and innovation. Actually, it rather should enhance development and innovation. And the second point I'd like to highlight here, it's very important that we're not discussing for individual companies or individual countries. We're discussing about what is best for everyone, and I think that was a very important point you made, Daniel. Now, let me turn to Joanna Bryson from Berlin. Do you think the EU will be successful in getting other countries to adopt its ethical standards in artificial intelligence? We had a little bit of this in the China debate that I had with Alexander a while ago, but would you please explore on this?
Okay, all right. I hope you can hear me. Thanks so much for having me on this panel. This has been great. I'm really thrilled to totally disagree with at least two of the speakers. So can we be successful? You know, when Google was writing its AI policies, I was actually in the policy center in London quite a lot, talking to them about that. And people were telling me, you know, the GDPR, nobody's going to do business in Europe anymore. And I didn't only hear that from Google. Let's not just name one company. I heard that from multiple big tech companies up to the deadline. And they were there the next day. The EU has successfully shown how we can lead the world by just saying, hey, you want access to our citizens? Then you have to play by our rules, right? And then people were saying to me, oh, we can't believe this. The GDPR, like, okay, but now it's so easy to do business in Europe. It's like, we're a trading bloc. It was set up to make us more economically successful. And now big tech is again pushing back on this. So as someone who's been recommending some of this got pushed back on, I just really want to point out some of these consequences. I think it's a bad idea to say, oh, what's high risk? It's a novel application of a new machine learning algorithm. No, nobody saw that liking kittens was high risk, okay? We need to absolutely keep records and have accountability like any other sector, right? And big tech, not big tech, AI is already well regulated within, for example, automotive, right? When there's a crash, we can go back and find out what happened. We have those records. And, you know, Microsoft is not so worried about transparency. They have transparency centers where governments, not academics, incidentally, for whatever reason, we're kept out, but governments are able to go in and say, hey, is there a cyber attack going on? What's going on right now? Is it your software? What's the problem? We need this kind of inspection. Pharma has 10 times the IP that tech has. And they still have government inspection. We have to have trusted brokers so that we can benefit everybody. And I think that you can absolutely lead in these ways by just making common sense rules as we did with the GDPR. So yes, I think we can do this. I think we will be attacked. But I think one of the real incredible tools we have is that we have figured out ways to collaborate between diverse companies to harmonize countries. And we do need to collaborate. I don't want to make big tech out to be, or whatever it means. I agree with whatever that means. So I didn't do everything. We do need to figure out how to collaborate with these large institutions that have grown up. I did really agree with a lot of the things that Amy was saying at the beginning, that we do have these strengths, and we do have. I'm sorry, I'm digressing slightly. I want to have one more thing because I realize I'm hitting the 5 minutes. We are not going to be, it's not going to be just the EU. There's going to be a lot of other countries. I've done a big study just recently that hopefully will be coming out before too long, but I can already share the data about this market cap thing, about innovation, what's happening where in the world. You know, we have more patents than China has. In the EEA, excluding UK and Switzerland. Where's all the market cap? It's in Switzerland. Why? I don't know, right? But market cap is a weird thing. It is a form of power when we allow companies to have that much. which is probably why the EU doesn't allow companies to get to the position that Google is in now. But Google has created incredible public goods, right? They have a fiber optic network that circles the entire globe. They have their own chip manufacturing. They have cybersecurity that, frankly, the EU cannot produce right now. We do not have the capacity for chip manufacturing. So I think we really need to be thinking about what are the roles of governments. You know, have they changed now that there are companies offering these services? Or should we allow companies to have like this incredible amassment of power that isn't directly related to what is actually their core technologies or where they're actually deriving the money? So they have like this really weird things happening. So how do we work together as companies to help us deal? Oh, and another thing, this assault on China. You know, all the governments of the world are not necessarily reflecting the desires of the majority of their citizens. And we've seen democratic backsliding in a lot of places. But the Chinese people also have been really good at, I mean, surprisingly good given their context, at protesting and reducing some of the invasions of privacy happening there too. So we need to be thinking about the whole world, and we need to be thinking about how do we find ways to guide both governments and corporations to things that actually protect all of us. And I think the EU has been a great template. We have to keep improving, but we have to look at helping other nations form hubs and networks like this too, and maybe also other corporations.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. Since you initially in your response made a couple of remarks in the direction of big tech, Daniel, if you want to respond briefly to this, please, you have 1 minute at this point.
I can do so very briefly. I mean, the most important thing I would say here is that we're not really pushing back on regulation. As I said, it's too important to not regulate. And we submitted quite an extensive brief in response to the white paper, where we make very detailed suggestions how you could proceed with regulation that would be smart, as we had heard it before, that would not hamper innovation too much. And I would simply invite everyone who's interested in learning more about the details to read these submissions. They're online, and you certainly find it using the search engine of your trust and choice.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now let's turn to Giga Turk. And for you, I've kept the most all-encompassing question of the kickoff statements here. Will the rise of artificial intelligence enable free individuals or rather big government? Over to you.
Thank you, Roland. First of all, I'm very happy to be in such a great company, in such a great panel. The short answer to your question is it depends, and I will explain why it depends and on what it depends. Now, my background, as you know, is in engineering, and AI is used a lot in my field to diagnose bridges, buildings, to do designs, evaluate designs, and so on. And if we demystify this whole story about AI, what it is really good at, it is to find patterns and learns from those patterns. So if patterns are there, AI will discover it, and basically you cannot prevent it from doing so. And it works extremely well in narrow fields. It's easy to make it work well in narrow fields. But you know that joke when a robot and human were playing chess in a house that was burning down, and what the best possible move was, of course, for the robot playing chess, the best possible move was how to move the chess piece. And for the human, the best possible move was to run out of the house because the house is burning. So this brings us to this issue of broader impacts of artificial intelligence. And actually, yes, this does go into the core of Western philosophy, economy, and also politics. And if we simplify a lot about the different views on society, economy, and politics between, let's say, the West and East, we can probably all agree that societies thrive if first one can use as many brains as possible, and secondly, if you can establish collaboration among them. And the balance is here a little bit different. We believe a little bit more into using as many brains as possible, giving people individual freedom to explore, think, etc. And in the East, they focus a little bit more on collaboration, on organizing these people to do something together. Now, we, of course, are in the history, in the economic history of economic liberalism of Mises and Hayek, and it is based on the idea that the sum of knowledge of all people is bigger than the knowledge that any central authority or any central planner could have. And this has been challenged many times with the advent of technology. The assumption was that perhaps if the government had the supercomputing power that can crunch a lot of data, of course, also get a lot of data, if you would also add artificial intelligence to that, the scales would tilt to the government from the, let's say, from the people, from the businesses. And actually, this has been tried. This has been tried in Chile by Salvador Allende in the 1970s. He had this project CyberSyn. The idea was, well, let's create a government supercomputer that would steer the economy. Now, the answer to this is actually very simple. If the government is not the only one that has access to AI power, if also businesses have access or citizens have access, then again, the sum of all AI tools, the sum of all of artificial intelligences out there will be bigger than the centralized artificial intelligence. Now, whether the sum of technology that is out there is bigger than the technology available to governments, that depends if that technology is democratically available. And this brings us to the issue of democracy and artificial intelligence. And in my view, democracy is one of the ways, currently the best way to enable the organization of peaceful collaboration among people. And this requires enforcement of some agreed rules. And by selecting the politicians that make the rules, we are quite likely to obey them. Now, my point related to your question is that the goal, the end goal of the whole story is not a free individual, but efficient collaboration. And in democracy, what people want is expressed so that they vote or take part in democratic institutions, they vote in elections, they take part in civil society. This gives the government's kind of input legitimacy. And actually, you could envision a scenario where big data and artificial intelligence would tell the government what people want better than the people know this themselves and express that by voting. And if people would be satisfied by that, this would give the rulers some kind of output legitimacy. And let's not pretend this is not happening. This is a little bit like Facebook recommending you what to read. Facebook does this better than you do this yourself. Of course, the danger is the abuse of such power. You could have a benevolent government artificial intelligence that knows everything, or you can have a malignant 1984 kind of digital authoritarianism. The governmental suppression of ideas, creativity, needs, wants, desires of all others. And I think the only tool against this, it's not rules so much, it's not regulations. The only weapon against it, not only of the monopoly of the governmental AI power, but also of the monopoly of one business's AI power, is the prevention of monopolizing the power of artificial intelligence. And this brings my thought back to my engineering field and the history of engineering. Progress did not happen when some technology, like writing and copying books, when some technology was limited to an elite. Progress happened when it was available to everybody. So press, not parchment. And I think the most important thing is to have as many artificial intelligences, as broadly distributed technology, as much available to everybody as possible. It is just a tool, and it empowers those with access to it. If the only ones with access are dictators, it will empower the dictators. If the only ones with access to it are big businesses, it will empower those. If the only ones are governments, it will empower those. So democratize artificial intelligence, give it to the people and to the businesses.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Giga. I would like to turn to Anna now at this point. Do we have a result of the Slido poll, and are there any other questions from Facebook?
Thanks, Roland. Indeed, we do. I suggest we have a look at the poll results first. We see we have a clear majority. So 76% of our audience think that indeed the rise of artificial intelligence is a positive development. I'd now like to move on to Facebook questions. We have a couple. The first one is from James Cantor. To what degree does success for Europe when it comes to the digital agenda and AI imply strategic autonomy for Europe? The second question from Bartholomew Kot. Should we regulate the usage of artificial intelligence in the electoral process, namely campaigning? So Roland, I leave those questions with you for further discussion.
Okay, but two excellent questions. And as to the first one on strategic autonomy, let's turn to Eva Meidel for a second, and then maybe others that would volunteer to come in. Eva, what's your answer to this?
Well, I mean, it's a strategic autonomy is again one of these buzzwords I find, and what we have to make sure is that we fill it with some substance, and the substance could actually come from the fact that we would, lay out this. I used to call them shovel-ready projects. Perhaps they're software-ready projects, better to put them. We could fill it with substance only if we start, continuing excelling in our productivity, for example, because I gave that as an example earlier in my intro remarks. So we could only, fill it with substance if we are to change the way we are operating, both on the side of industry, but also in society. So strategic autonomy would mean so many things. And it's good to put it there as a leadership instrument. Let's put it this way. But on the other hand, we have to do our job. We have to walk the talk, and we have to do it with some substance. So we would only be able to achieve it in certain areas if we have a plan. And right now, you would say, yes, as Europe, we actually do have a plan. We know where we want to invest. We know where the resources should be going, but we need to follow up on that. So it's one thing what the Brussels bubble says, and it's a different thing what member states are doing and what their priorities are. And it's a very tricky balance to achieve, to kind of aspire to the big goals of the Brussels bubbles for some member states. So in order for us to do that, we need to understand that those priorities are not just priorities of the European institutions, but they have to be priorities of the member states. In this way, I could see strategic autonomy being something more than a buzzword.
Thank you, Eva. I saw that Alexander Stubb and then Joanna wanted to make a remark. Go ahead, Alexander. Sorry, you got to switch on your mic.
I was trying to be a good student and keep it on mute so that all the sounds from Florence won't come all the way there. Two answers. The first one is, as long as strategic autonomy does not mean protectionism, closing up, turning inward, sort of as a pretext for what has traditionally been called this sort of European industrial policy. I wrote the Financial Times column in 2016, which was provocatively titled, For China, Europe is the New Africa. And the basic argument at the time was that China was doing to European IP and IPOs the same that it was doing to African raw materials. And this was the time when the Ekstrom case hit. In other words, a German company which had some military intelligence that was about to be acquired by a Chinese company, the owner of which we weren't really clear about. And I said that we probably need to be aware that this is taking place, but at the same time, we should not overreact. We should have some kind of a European CFIUS. I think that would work quite well. My second answer is, you know what? It's going to depend a little bit on what happens in the US elections. If we want to have space to maneuver, if we want to have strategic autonomy, then it's probably paradoxically going to mean that we're going to sometimes have to make a choice between China and the US. And my rather provocative argument would be that, yes, we have a similar value base with the US and stick with the transatlantic alliance. But if you want to be serious about strategic autonomy, we need to play ball with the Chinese as well. So I would say that we should go 75% American, 25% Chinese. We can do that easier if Donald Trump is elected. If Joe Biden is elected, it's going to be more difficult to do because that's when we have to fall into line and cooperate more with the Americans. Sorry for being so geopolitically shrewd here.
Thank you, Alexander. I saw people shaking their heads when you were talking about choosing between China and the US and possibly combining the two in this way or the other. Joanna, you would like to comment on this?
No, to quickly respond to that, the problem is that, again, this isn't published yet, but there's so much more to the world. Don't underestimate the rest of the world the way that we've been underestimated ourselves. So there's lots of things happening in Asia with people who do not cooperate with China. There's lots of things happening in other regions, and we really all look to the future where Africa comes online. The same way that Europe has benefited from diversity, Africa has even more diversity. The same way we were slowed down by figuring out how to collaborate, Africa's been slowed down. So we really need to look broadly. Back to this autonomy, there's two sides of it. One of it is with the era of the digital, there's an extent to which we cannot be separated anymore. That was already true because of finance, the ecosystem. But I think it's really interesting that France created its own COVID app and said, look, for small countries, I think they specifically mentioned Slovenia, I'm afraid, that maybe they need to use Google and Apple. But hey, we've got our own infrastructure. For us, it's lower risk to use in-house. Their citizens didn't agree. There's much higher compliance in Germany, where I'm sitting now, because of the fact we're using the Apple Google. That was seen as more safe. So we have to recognize the extent to which we are now more and more interdependent. But at the same time, again, like we've seen with logistics chains post-COVID, absolutely, we have to maintain diversity, just like we did with airlines, just like we did with GPS. It's a really interesting question. How do we get to the point where we can build the scale of infrastructure? People think AI is like some weird cloudy, magic thing. It's not. The scale of infrastructure that's been built by the tech giants is immense. So how can we possibly replicate that? Can we think of some of the tech giants' aspects as utilities, transnational utilities? Can we get the tech giants themselves to provide redundancy as one of the public goods, one of their forms of redistribution into the UN or into the EU? But I'd rather think globally. There's really big, interesting governance questions about how we're all going to cooperate going forward to have a stable, sustainable planet where we can do business and where we can, thrive and raise families.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna, and thanks also to James Cantor for the great question. We've got to move on to the other question by Bartek Kot, and that was about artificial intelligence, big data, and campaigning. And I would like to direct this question to Giga Turk. Giga, what is the optimal relationship between these factors I named? Over to you.
It's actually similar to the last question, whether we should allow or whether AI should be allowed in political campaigning and so on and so forth, or whether it should be prohibited. And again, it's nothing mystical about AI. it finds patterns. It finds patterns and it learns from that patterns, and it does so better than humans. It lacks some of this broad perspective on things which are kind of not in the data set or which are kind of common sense, but it's getting better with that every day. And my answer to your question would be yes, allow pattern finding, allow studying of the voters, etc. in election campaigns. Possibly in such a way that the competing parties can all use this technology. However, I don't think this will improve democracy. What will happen is that increasingly the short-term desires of the electorate would be increasingly well represented at what politicians will be saying, of course at the expense of long-term strategies which politicians should have. But in principle, I don't think we would achieve anything by prohibiting the use of AI in politics or in campaigning or anywhere. It just has to be competition. If the Republicans and the Democrats can both use Twitter and Facebook and data like Cambridge Analytica, let the best guy win.
Thank you very much. We would have 2 more minutes for a commentary from someone else. I'm just looking at Joanna, who seems eager to comment upon this. Would you want a really 120 seconds on this? Over to you. No. All right. Anybody else who would like to comment? Eva, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, I think it's a topic which we would like to further explore in the newly set up AI committee to basically try to make sure we understand what are the positive effects of AI in electoral process. As well as the negative. And on top of my mind, of course, also as Ziga was saying, I mean, one could see opportunities in a way that we could better reach people, for example, and inform them about the political process. There is such a big chunk of society still nowadays that is unsure what the European institutions do, and not to mention it's unsure what even their local institutions are doing. And in this way, you could actually strengthen, in a way, the democratic society because you provide more information. But of course, that would be a very ideal scenario. And unfortunately, we have seen it way too often how AI is embedded for improper use of data and on the darker purposes in campaigning. And of course, clearly Cambridge Analytica is one such example, but it's almost on a daily basis. Even this morning, I came across an article which, of course, once again restates how often the alt-right ideas and ideas that are basically promoted that are based on disinformation are shared tens of thousands more times than fact-based stories. So when we are to regulate in a way how fact-based trustworthy news and claims go viral, we need to make sure we not only use the false ones. And I think this will and was and will continue to be a major problem in the elections, as we're seeing also in the US right now, but also all over the world.
Thanks a lot, Eva. I think this is the right time to wrap up the whole debate. Unless there is an urgent comment from any of you, that is not the case, then let me give you yes, sorry, Alexander Stub. But very
I was
shortly.
going to give you a commercial break at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. We have an absolutely fantastic center called EDMO, which does fact checking. Please go ahead and check it out.
Great. Thank you so much, EDMO in Florence. Okay, now the wrap up, the takeaways. The European Union is off to a good start, arguably, in the white paper of the Commission. in order to promote leadership and promote a better development, a better approach to artificial intelligence in the European Union. We have this a triangle of regulation, competition, and finance, which will keep us busy for the years to come. And on regulation, I think we can all agree that the magical formula will be to make regulation enhancing and not impeding innovation and development. That's the most important one. I think on the question of the EU setting standards that are actually joined and observed by the rest of the world, the EU can set standards, and we have seen this over the last couple of years. And the EU actually it has a big trump card, and that is the single market and access to it by others, which gives the EU some negotiating power. So the question of the European Union getting countries like China, for example, to accept moral standards and ethical standards that they wouldn't accept for the use of AI and big data in their own country, the chances are good that they would accept at least that for the single market of the European Union. And finally, and probably most importantly, the intricate interplay between artificial intelligence, big data on the one hand, and democracy on the other. And I think we've had some beautiful and some less beautiful examples. The case of Cambridge Analytica was discussed, but also the prospect that actually artificial intelligence and big data could enhance the leadership of a democratic country in gauging what people really expect and adjusting their policies accordingly. And of course, in authoritarian regimes, big data and artificial intelligence can be used for nefarious purposes that I think we don't even need to debate about this. And the last point on this AI and democracy one is the most optimistic scenario would be one where AI is distributed to the people and empowers individuals to better participate in the democratic process. And I think that with that optimistic scenario, I might as well leave you for the takeaways. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating in this, giving their arguments, sharing their wisdom and their insights. And I would like to hand it back over to Anna. Thank you very much all for participating. Anna, floor is yours again.
A great panel to end our forum with. And right before our closing remarks, ladies and gentlemen, we will break for a short 5 minutes. We'll be back soon.